consumed. It was 5 o'clock now. We were still trying not to make eye contact with one another, pretending not to notice there were other people in the waiting room. The truth was, we couldn't have been more aware of each other. One could hardly meet all their co-workers in a lifetime, as the facilities were truly enormous. But on that day, in that room, there was a terrifying and profound kinship between us, unlike any other. We were all guilty, but of what? We were all awaiting punishment, but of what kind? There was no reading material in the waiting room, and we had to hand over our phones before we entered it. They told us they would return them afterwards. The door we were supposed to enter was nothing special. It almost seemed like a door to someone's apartment. Above it there was a number, 261521, and on it there was a note saying, "Do not knock, your number will be called." The only unsettling thing about the door was the door handle. It was a knob which couldn't be opened from the outside. I wondered if there was a knob on the inside as well. We had been waiting for 2 hours now. It felt much longer though, as people would go in, but no one ever came out. They must have exited the room through a different door. It seemed quite strange, this EPT program. So many people had gone through it, and still no one knew what it actually was. I asked my mother once what it was like. There was a barely noticeable twitch. Then she said in her best reassuring voice, "You know I don't remember, honey. No one does." I knew she was going to say that, but I couldn't help wondering. Everyone seemed unaffected by the fact that 40% of people committed suicide afterwards. There was just one collective thought in the whole waiting room. Do I belong to the 40%? It was smart of them to call us in the middle of the day with no prior notice. If I had a week to think about this, I probably wouldn't have made it through the week. As I was thinking about this, I noticed something strange. No one was crying, not one person. It hadn't even occurred to me before that. We were all still in shock, I guess. Since I had already gone from utter despair to fervent optimism and back again several times, and since I had already counted the gray specks on the linoleum under my feet about 30 times, my brain was beginning to get bored. I looked up for the first time. At that exact moment, the man sitting opposite me lifted his face as well, and completely without any kind of permission from our brains, our eyes met. It was disastrous. The complacency which I had worked on for the last 2 hours was completely ruined by one glance from a burly old man with a mustache. Instantly, I began examining the chart that was hanging behind him. I looked at it intently. The man, however, did not look away. He kept looking at my protesting eyes as I kept focusing on the chart. Although I couldn't make out a single word, I never wear my glasses. There was something judgmental about his stare. I felt annoyed, although I knew what he was thinking. Actually, I felt annoyed because I knew what he was thinking. Isn't he a bit young to be here? I was the youngest in the room, obviously, but this did not need additional pointing out, not even with just a look. I was angry at him for almost making me burst into tears, although the anger was a nice change from almost bawling. He finally released me from his ocular grasp and looked back down. I decided to examine all the charts in this way. It's amazing how hungry the brain is for stimuli and how quickly one can feel like they're going insane when it lacks it. As soon as I was positive that a person was completely immersed in their own thoughts and in their own segment of linoleum, I would look at them more closely. The first subject was a businessman who clearly put too much effort into his looks. His hair was perfectly trimmed and his suit looked like it was painted on. He was obviously supposed to be something important. I love to see people like that when they are helpless. I feel that this is the only time they are truly sincere. I always hope they will have some sort of revelation as to what terrible human beings they have been until then, and simply change their ways forever. I was getting annoyed just by looking at him, so I moved on. I looked at the chart next to his. It was the biggest in the room. I could even make out the title, Human Resources Chart. That term always made me cringe. Under the chart, there was a woman with glasses in a matching brown suit and skirt just over the knees, very serious. She was beautiful in a boring way. Her brown hair was tied back so tightly she was unable to form any noticeable expression, save from one of disinterested boredom, which was obviously the point. You could tell, too, that she had been practicing it for many years, and she was very good at it. She made these loud sighs as if to say, "I don't have time for this. This is obviously a stupid mistake." But she knew full well that this wasn't true. 15 to 6. My butt was becoming quite numb. I felt like getting up, but I didn't feel like being looked at, so I sat some more. Suddenly, with no prior voices or footsteps from behind the door, it opened. It made us all twitch, as this was the first noise we had heard in almost 3 hours. The receptionist was quite pleasant looking. I seemed to have been expecting a stern old crone for some reason. She was wearing a gray pantsuit, which made her look more like an office clerk than a receptionist. You could tell she was quite aware of the formidability of her role. She proclaimed, "Number 494208919. Several people lifted their heads and began to search the room with their eyes, putting their perverse pleasure of staring at the dead man walking before the common decency of letting him think no one is looking. I stood up. It felt exactly like one of those naked in public dreams. I don't know which bothered me more, their pity or their relief. At least the latter was sincere, whereas the former was not. As I began to approach the woman, I realized my legs had fallen asleep. Wanting to conceal this, I kept walking, but the spiky cramps in my legs made me look like I had cerebral palsy. Great, I thought, more pity. I was almost relieved to leave the room. I entered the receptionist's room, and she closed the door behind me. I didn't have a knob. It was a normal door handle. She told me to sit down. Time passed. She wrote something down on her clipboard. I told myself she was just doodling to diffuse the awkward silence. The room was furnished very frugally. There was a cabinet, a table, 2 chairs, 2 doors, a lamp, and a pot plant. It looked like an unfinished AutoCAD image. It had no window, probably to keep us from knowing which floor we were on. The room was the kind of hospital green that is supposed to be calming, but is actually utterly depressing. She scribbled some more, and then, without any kind of signal from doctor, she said, "You can go in now." She said this so casually, I thought she truly believed that she was just a receptionist in a doctor's office. She was either genuinely oblivious or an extraordinarily good actress, as this was quite obviously not your everyday doctor's office. I looked at the door behind her, an ordinary door handle. I asked a stupid question. "Through there?" She, obviously used to this sort of behavior, ignored me, stood up, and opened the door herself. I stood up. My legs had woken up by now, save for some mild numbness, and walked towards the door at the other side of the room. She followed me in, which was quite strange and made me wonder about the whole meaning of the reception room. Was it only a test? We entered the room. Is this a joke? I thought. The room seemed staged. It looked like a scene from a bad sci-fi movie. It was nauseatingly sterile and empty, with nothing but a strange apparatus in the middle of it. It was about 10 feet tall and 5 feet wide. It had a comfortable seat, not unlike a dentist, and a large dome extending from the back of the seat and over it. To its left stood a man in tight green overalls, obviously one that operated with the machine. The lack of a white doctor's robe made him seem less formidable. A clever trick, I thought. Just a minute, I lost my thread. He was blonde and in his late 30s. He too could have been an unimaginative computer-generated image. He was wearing the smile of a pediatrician before he gives you a shot. I used to love those smiles as a child. Even though I knew they were a lie, they comforted me. But not now. Now it made me nervous. Instinctively, I took a step back. I bumped into the receptionist's chest, which was hovering behind me. I turned my head to see the door handle, knob. I began to sweat. My mind was racing. I felt trapped. The man could see this. She stepped closer and said calmly, "Do not worry, it will be over in a second." The lack of contractions made me nervous. The receptionist turned assistant, walked over to the machine and began adjusting the seat. I noticed the straps for the first time. The man saw that I was looking at them. He remarked, "Those are necessary so do not hurt yourself. The procedure may invoke involuntary muscle convulsions, and you could hurt yourself if your arms and hands are not strapped." He looked as though he truly believed this would make me feel better. The assistant gave him a nod. "You can sit down now," he said. He even made an ushering gesture. Was he enjoying this? I slowly approached the seat. I looked at it for a moment, then took a breath and plunged into it as if jumping off a cliff into water of uncertain depth. The assistant strapped me in, first my legs and then my arms. I felt so helpless. My perspiration began to show through my shirt. I hate sweat marks. I hate this exposure of fear. "Can I have some sort of sedative?" I asked, trying to hide my horror, but my trembling voice gave me away. "I am sorry, a sedative would interfere with the procedure. You must try to relax. It will be over in a second." I was trying not to cry. My fellow fienders from the waiting room should see me now. My carefully fabricated composure finally gave way and was replaced by a painfully sincere dread. The assistant began to lower the dome. "Hey," I said. She stopped. "Don't I get some sort of anesthetic?" The man laughed slightly. "This is not an operation. Consider it a brain scan. Keeping in mind, of course, that all the acquired information will be deleted instantly after it is acquired and will be known only to you. Now try to relax." The assistant lowered the dome. Total darkness surrounded me. All I could sense was a quiet buzzing noise. I was utterly terrified. The thing was soundproof. I could not hear what the doctor and his assistant were doing, and my imagination was playing sick tricks on me. I was convinced that a spike would come from the darkness and lodge itself in one of my eyes. I tried to force myself to calm down, but my brain wouldn't have it. It knew I had a completely legitimate reason to be panicking. Then it began. The images moved with incredible speed, but somehow I could observe each one individually and clearly without difficulty. I could see hundreds of people, men and women, young and old, although there were more children than adults. Just everyday scenes from their lives. I was seeing it like a memory. I didn't understand. I didn't know these people. What was the point? I began to notice that most of them were poor. Was it supposed to make me feel pity? But it didn't seem unhappy at all. This went on for quite a long time, just face after face racing before me. Then, in the same order as before, the lives of these people began to unravel. A woman crying over her dismembered body of her husband, thousands of factory accidents, severed limbs, heads, big machines crushing people, people burning to death, acid spilling on their hands, their skin melting, medieval-looking diseases, boils, rashes, terrible pain, stinging, vomiting, blood, shitting blood, skin peeling off. Then came the wars. People shot in the genitals and left to bleed out, terrible gang rapes with bayonets, broken bottles, children watching. I saw years in a second, terrible years, whole lifetimes went by. By now, I was screaming uncontrollably. Somehow, I didn't only feel my own terror, I could feel their emotions as well. I could feel them as if it was happening to me. I tried to look away, but it was impossible. It was inside my head. It was my own thoughts. If it wasn't for the straps, I would have scratched the skin off my face by now. Then a single thought penetrated through the others. A distinct, artificial-sounding thought began to resound in my head. I could not tell whether it was mine or whether it came from somewhere else, but it was very clear. You did this. Subject 494208919 underwent enhanced perception therapy without complication. Following the procedure, subject declined sedative. 14th May 2030. Subject is in good health and will be released from our care. 15th of May 2030. Subject took his own life in his home.